They told us the stories were exaggerated. They told us the haunting was a marketing trick, a rumor that spiraled into fame, a legend born from fear itself. But if that were true, then why did every person who spent a night inside that house whisper the same warning, in the same trembling voice, with the same haunted look in their eyes? Because something inside that house remembers. And it waits for anyone foolish enough to listen. The year was 1974, long after the infamous tragedy had stained Amityville with a shadow that refused to lift. A crisp November night carried the smell of the Atlantic, the kind that chills the bones before anyone realizes they are shivering. On that night, a man named Elric Dane arrived on Ocean Avenue after receiving a letter that claimed to contain evidence about what truly happened inside the house. The letter was unsigned, the handwriting shaky, as if the writer had been terrified while writing it. Elric was not a thrill seeker. He was a former investigative journalist who had spent years uncovering stories people wanted to bury. His voice carried a calm steadiness, yet even he hesitated as he stepped out of his aging copper-colored sedan, staring at the silhouette of the house under the street lamps. The windows glowed with a pale reflection of the moon, giving the eerie impression that something inside was staring out. He checked his pocket watch. 9:22 at night. The air felt tense, remarkably still, as if the entire block was holding its breath. He made his way toward the gate. The wind grazed the dry leaves across the pavement, creating a scraping sound that felt too deliberate. He swallowed hard and whispered a quiet reassurance to himself, his breath visible in the cold air. When he reached the front door, he noticed it was slightly open. Not wide, just enough to suggest someone had been there recently. He paused, listening. No footsteps. No voices. Only silence so heavy it pressed into his ears. With a slow inhale, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The scent hit him first. Damp wood, dust, and something faintly metallic. The floorboards creaked under his shoes, echoing through the empty hall. He aimed his flashlight toward the staircase where countless witnesses over the years claimed to have heard whispering voices. The beam of light flickered for a moment before stabilizing. He moved deeper into the house and reached the living room. Moonlight trickled through the old glass panels, casting long, warped shadows on the floor. The fireplace was cold, yet the air around it felt strangely warm, almost like a breath brushing across his skin. Then the first sound broke the silence. A soft tapping. Slow. Measured. Coming from the upper floor. Elric's pulse quickened. He raised the light toward the ceiling, exhaling a shaky breath. He whispered in a low voice, "Please, not this early." The house answered only with another solitary tap, this one sharper than the first. He took a step back, then another, but forced himself to remain still. He had faced dangerous criminals, corrupt officials, even threats on his life. Yet nothing had ever twisted his stomach with such primal dread. He climbed the staircase, each step groaning beneath him. The tapping stopped just as he reached the top. A quiet corridor stretched ahead, its wallpaper peeling in long strips. At the far end, a door stood slightly ajar, just like the front door. The air felt charged, as if waiting. He whispered, "Is someone here?" His voice trembled despite his effort to remain calm. A sudden gust of frigid wind blew down the hallway, sweeping past him and slamming the door shut with a thunderous crack. Elric flinched, his heart punching against his ribs. His flashlight flickered again. Then the voice spoke. Soft. Close. Too close. Do not open that door. Elric spun around, his breath escaping in a sharp gasp. No one was behind him. No footsteps. No shadow. Only the echo of the whisper lingering in the hallway like smoke. He called out, "Who said that?" But the silence returned instantly, swallowing his question whole. Despite every instinct screaming at him to leave, he gripped the doorknob. It was ice cold, painfully cold, as if it had been pulled from a block of frozen steel. He twisted it slowly, trying to keep control of his breathing. The door creaked open. Inside the room, the temperature dropped sharply. His breath turned into thick clouds. The walls were bare, but the floor was covered in deep scratches, carved in frantic, chaotic patterns. The wood looked shredded, as though something had been dragged violently across it, over and over. His flashlight beam trembled as he followed the gouges toward the far corner. There, on the wall, words had been etched by hand, crooked and uneven. "It watches through the walls." Elric staggered back, a soft whimper escaping his throat. The message looked old, yet the edges of the carving were clean, as if it had been made recently, by someone with shaking hands. He felt the presence before he heard it. A cold pressure behind him. A weight in the air. A slow inhale that did not belong to him. He turned around. Nothing. But the house felt awake now. The wall seemed to pulse, faintly, rhythmically, as if the structure itself were breathing. A low hum began to rise from deep below the floor, vibrating through the wood beneath his feet. He backed out of the room and pulled the door closed, though he knew it would not matter. As he stepped into the hallway, the lights of his flashlight dimmed. The hum grew louder. And then, suddenly, he heard footsteps. Not upstairs. Not behind him. But inside the walls. They moved with slow, deliberate pacing, dragging along the narrow spaces behind the old beams. The sound traveled beside him as he walked, matching his pace perfectly, as though something unseen was walking alongside him just out of sight. Elric whispered through clenched teeth, "You're not real. You're not real." A whisper answered immediately, its tone soft yet trembling with amusement. "Are you sure?" He gasped and stumbled down the stairs, nearly slipping on the last step. The living room felt even darker now, as if the shadows had grown thicker, denser. He swept the light across the room, but it only illuminated a small fraction of the darkness. Then he saw the outline. A human shape standing near the doorway to the kitchen. Unmoving. Silent. Watching. Elric froze. His chest tightened so violently he could barely breathe. The shape tilted its head slowly, the motion unnatural, as though its neck resisted the movement. His throat tightened as he whispered, "What do you want?" The figure leaned forward slightly. The words floated across the room, chilling, deliberate, and spoken with a voice that echoed as if spoken from inside the house itself. "It wants you to stay." Elric backed away. He turned and ran toward the front door, but the moment he reached it, the door slammed shut. Every window shuddered at once. The walls trembled. The house groaned like a living creature in pain or hunger. He twisted the doorknob desperately. Locked. He threw his shoulder against the wood, shouting with raw panic. The house answered with a low rumbling moan that rose from the foundation like a warning. He looked over his shoulder. The shadow figure was gone. The silence was more terrifying than the footsteps had been. Then the whispers began. Dozens. Layered. Overlapping. Circling him from every corner of the room. Some voices pleaded. Some laughed. Some screamed in agony. And one voice, deeper than the others, resonated from the walls with a cold satisfaction. "You should not have come here." Elric's vision blurred as panic overwhelmed him. He banged on the door again, shouting for help, his voice cracking with desperation. Something brushed against his shoulder, cold and thin like skeletal fingers. He cried out and swung the flashlight wildly. Nothing was there. Then the lights in the house flickered, all at once, glowing with a dim reddish tint. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a single slow thumping sound coming from the basement. It pulsed like a heartbeat. Strong. Heavy. Relentless. Elric closed his eyes tightly, whispering to himself, "Please let me out. Please." A long moment passed. Then the front door creaked open slowly on its own, as if offering him a chance. He did not hesitate. He sprinted outside, stumbling onto the cold ground. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crack that echoed down the empty street. His chest heaved. His hands shook uncontrollably. He scrambled to his car, turned the ignition with trembling fingers, and sped away without looking back. But even as he left Ocean Avenue, he heard it. A whisper bleeding into the wind. Soft. Hungry. Patient. "Come back. We are not finished." Elric never returned to Amityville. But he spoke of that night only once more, many years later, in a trembling voice that suggested he still heard the whispers every time he closed his eyes. And the house still stands there, waiting for the next person who believes the stories are only stories, unaware that something inside remembers every voice, every footstep, and every soul that ever dared to enter. Elric Dane spent the weeks following his escape trying to convince himself that the events inside the Amityville house were nothing more than a reaction to fear, exhaustion, or the power of suggestion. But no matter how he tried to rationalize it, something deeper gnawed at him, a feeling that the house had not let him go. He carried the sensation everywhere, like a cold hand pressed against the back of his neck. The nightmares began first. In each dream, he found himself back on Ocean Avenue, standing in front of the house while the windows watched him with a pale, hungry glow. The air in these dreams always felt thick, almost wet, and the house seemed to pulse with low vibrations that shook the ground beneath his feet. When he tried to wake up, the door of the house would creak open, slowly, deliberately, as if beckoning him with a promise he did not want to understand. He would always wake moments before stepping across the threshold, drenched in sweat, gasping, his chest pounding with a fear that lingered even in the daylight. For a time, he avoided telling anyone about what he had experienced. But isolation made the memories stronger. Every faint noise inside his home turned his blood cold, every shadow stretched too long across the floor, every whisper of wind outside his window sounded like a voice calling his name. Eventually, with trembling hands, he contacted an old colleague living in Albany. Her name was Maren Loch, a researcher of obscure folklore and forgotten American hauntings. Maren was the type who chased stories most people refused to believe, and she had helped him before on cases that pushed the boundaries of reason. They met in a small diner off a quiet rural highway. The place was nearly empty, the overhead lights buzzing faintly. Outside, snow drifted lazily under the dim glow of the street lamps. Elric entered with a heavy breath, scanning the room nervously despite knowing no one was watching him. Maren sat in a booth near the back, sipping black coffee. Her dark hair was braided loosely over her shoulder, and her gray coat draped around her like a soft shadow. When she saw Elric, she raised an eyebrow but offered a gentle smile. He sat across from her and clasped his hands together tightly. She said in a low voice, "You look like you haven't slept in days." He swallowed hard. "I haven't. Not really. Tell me everything." He hesitated. Even saying the words felt dangerous, as if speaking them aloud might somehow draw the attention of the thing that had followed him out of that house. But Maren's steady gaze gave him just enough courage to describe the tapping sounds, the whispering voice, the carved warnings inside the upstairs room, the presence behind the walls, the shadow figure in the living room, and the door that opened only when the house allowed him to leave. As he recounted the details, Maren's expression shifted from curiosity to quiet alarm. She did not interrupt him once. When he finally finished, his breath shaking, she leaned back slowly and folded her hands. "Elric," she said gently, "there is something you need to understand. That house has a reputation, yes. But not for the reasons most people think. The stories about the haunting, the sensational claims, they distract from the older truth." He stared at her, dread prickling his skin. "Older truth? What older truth?" She lowered her voice even further. Before the tragedies, before the headlines, before the tourists, that house had been the center of a quiet investigation. Reports of voices inside the walls date back to the early 1900s. Long before the modern legends, people claimed the foundation was built on land where something was buried. Something ancient, forgotten, and not meant to be disturbed. Elric rubbed his forehead. "That's absurd. If that were true, why didn't anyone publicize it?" "Because the families who knew about it refused to stay long enough to speak. And the others disappeared." He stared at her, his pulse throbbing painfully. "Disappeared? What do you mean disappeared?" Maren slid a thin folder across the table toward him. It was old, its edges curled, the paper inside yellowed with age. Elric hesitated before opening it. The first page held a photograph taken in what looked like the early 20th century. The house looked newer then, its paint unweathered, its shape less sinister. In front of it stood a family of 6, their expressions stiff and forced, eyes hollow despite the posed nature of the picture. Maren said softly, "They moved in during the summer of 1912. By autumn, all 6 were gone. No sign of struggle. No signs they packed. Just gone." The sheriff at the time reported that neighbors had heard strange noises the night before the family vanished. Scraping. Crying. And something else they refused to describe. Elric felt the room tilt slightly. He swallowed, but his throat was dry. "And the walls, the footsteps I heard, the voice. What do you think it is?" Her eyes darkened. "I think whatever is inside that house is older than the building. Older than the town. And I think it attaches itself to people who enter. It marks them. It doesn't matter if you leave. It follows." A cold surge rushed through Elric's chest. "Followed? You think it followed me?" Maren did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched the snow fall outside the window, the silence between them stretching uncomfortably. When she finally turned back to him, her voice trembled slightly despite her attempt to remain calm. "Have you heard anything since that night?" Any sounds in your home? Any whispers? Elric exhaled shakily. Yes. I hear tapping at night. And sometimes, I hear breathing that isn't mine. Marin reached across the table and lightly touched his arm. Then we need to act quickly. The longer you wait, the stronger its hold becomes. It wants something from you. Maybe information. Maybe memory. Maybe something more. He shivered violently, the hum of the diner's lights suddenly sounding too loud, too sharp. What do we do? Marin pulled a small leather notebook from her bag and flipped through it until she found a page filled with handwritten notes and symbols. There's a man I know in the town of Haverwick. His name is Audrin Vale. He specializes in historical hauntings tied to old land rituals. If anyone can help you break the connection, it will be him. Elric nodded slowly, though fear still tightened his lungs. When do we leave? Tonight, if possible. Waiting would be dangerous. As they stepped outside, the air felt strangely thicker than before, as if the cold itself had gained weight. Snowflakes drifted quietly across the parking lot, but the night seemed unnaturally still. Elric sensed something watching him from the darkness beyond the street lamps, something that moved when he didn't look directly at it. He forced himself into Marin's car, trying not to glance at the shifting shadows near the tree lean. As the engine rumbled to life, a faint sound echoed from the direction of the diner. A whisper. Soft. Familiar. Elric. He jolted, breath freezing in his chest. His eyes darted across the snowy darkness, but nothing moved. Marin whispered, "You heard it, didn't you?" He nodded silently. They drove north, the road winding through empty stretches of farmland and forest. For miles, neither spoke. The sky above them was a dull gray, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. The snow on the road reflected the headlights in a pale, ghostly glow. As they neared Haverwick, the forest grew dense, branches overhanging the narrow road like skeletal hands reaching toward the car. The wind picked up, moaning through the trees in a low, unsettling tone. Elric gripped the door handle tightly and fought the urge to look behind him, but something deep in him sensed that if he turned around, he would see a figure sitting in the back seat, watching him in silence. After an hour, Marin slowed the car. A small wooden sign read Haverwick, though the paint was so faded it was barely legible. Houses were scattered widely, separated by long stretches of dark woods. The streets were empty. Marin guided the car toward a sloping dirt driveway leading to an old house tucked behind a cluster of tall pines. Its structure leaned slightly, as though the ground beneath it had shifted over the years. A single lantern glowed beside the door. Audrin Vale answered before they could knock, as if he had been waiting. His hair was long and silver, his eyes a strange shade of pale amber. He looked at Elric with an expression that mixed curiosity and pity. "You brought something with you." Elric's heart dropped. He opened his mouth to speak, but Audrin raised a hand. "Do not say its name. Names give strength. Come inside. Quickly." And the house behind them creaked, a long, low groan that made Elric's skin crawl. He sensed something moving in the woods, something tall and silent that mirrored every step he took toward the doorway. As he crossed the threshold, he felt a sudden heaviness settle over him, as though a weight had been dropped on his shoulders. Audrin shut the door firmly and locked it with 3 separate bolts. Then he looked at Elric with a grave expression. "You did not escape Amityville. No one escapes. Not truly. The house marked you, and now it reaches for you through the shadows. We must sever the connection before it takes you completely." Elric felt his breath stutter. "Takes me. Takes me where?" Audrin did not blink. "Into the walls." Elric's knees nearly buckled as the room around him darkened, the lantern light flickering violently as something pressed against the windows from the outside. A slow, muffled tapping sounded from the walls of Audrin's home. Then another. And another. Growing louder. The same tapping Elric had heard in the Amityville house. The same slow, patient rhythm. Marin whispered shakily, "It followed us here." Audrin leaned close to Elric and spoke in a low, urgent voice. "You must understand. It wants your voice. It wants your memories. It wants the living parts of you that the house cannot consume on its own. If we do not break the bond, it will pull you back. Not your body. Not at first. But your mind, your sense of self, your soul." Elric trembled. "What do I do? Tell me what to do." Audrin placed a trembling hand on Elric's shoulder. "Do not listen to it. No matter what it says." The tapping stopped. Silence filled the room so quickly that Elric felt the pressure of it in his chest. Then from the far wall, a soft voice whispered with impossible clarity. "Elric, open the door." His heart hammered wildly. Audrin tightened his grip. "Do not answer." Another whisper. This one closer. Breathing against the wood. "We remember you." Elric squeezed his eyes shut, his breath ragged. "We saw you run. We let you go. So you would lead us. Here." The lantern light flickered again, dimming as an icy draft flooded the room. The wood beneath their feet vibrated, the boards groaning as something moved underneath the foundation, inching upward, crawling toward the very center of the house. Audrin backed away toward a table covered in ancient books and worn tools. Merrin clutched Elric's arm as the walls began to bend inward, the wooden planks stretching like skin pressed from the other side. Audrin whispered with terror he could no longer hide. "It is not the house that is haunted. It is the ground. It is the thing buried beneath. And now it wants to rise." Elric stepped backward as a crack split through the center of the wooden floor. From the darkness below, something began to breathe. Slow. Deep. Hungry. Merrin cried out as the lights went out entirely. And in the darkness, the whispered voice grew louder, circling them, echoing inside their heads with a dreadful joy. "You came back to us. And we are not finished." The floorboards buckled. The walls shuddered. The house groaned as if awakening. Elric felt the cold breath behind him again. And when he turned, he saw the shadow from Amityville standing only inches away. Its head tilted. Its voice seeped into his ear like a knife made of ice. "You belong with us now." The board split open beneath his feet. He fell. Falling into darkness deeper than any place he had ever imagined. As he plunged into the void below the house, the last thing he heard was Merrin screaming his name while Audrin shouted ancient words that were swallowed instantly by the darkness. Then the whisper came again. Soft. Satisfied. Patient. "We have you." And the darkness closed over him. Elric did not remember hitting the ground. He did not remember the fall at all. Only the darkness. And the feeling that something enormous, something ancient, was waiting for him beneath the house as if the fall had simply delivered him into its open hands. The darkness around him felt alive. Not merely empty, but attentive. It pressed against his skin like thick, cold breath. Elric tried to speak, but no sound came from his throat. He could not tell whether his voice had abandoned him, or whether the darkness simply swallowed every word before it could form. For a while, he floated, weightless, suspended in nothingness. Then, slowly, shapes began to appear. Dim red glows like distant fires flickered below him, rising and fading as if the earth itself were pulsing with embers. The ground finally materialized beneath him, cracked and uneven, with deep grooves carved into the soil in spirals that made no sense to his mind. When his feet touched the ground, a tremor ran through the cavern. A single whisper crawled across the air. "You have come home." Elric spun around, breath trembling. The sound had not come from a single direction. It had echoed from every corner of the cavern, as if the entire space had spoken with one voice. He took several shaky steps backward, but the red-lit ground stretched endlessly in every direction. Above him, the split floor of Audrin's house was gone. Gone completely. Only solid darkness towered overhead. Elric whispered, "Someone help me. Please." A low, rumbling tone rolled through the cavern, like distant thunder echoing through ancient stone. Then the red glows brightened, revealing jagged pillars of rock rising from the ground. Shadows shifted between the pillars, tall and thin, moving with slow, deliberate motions. Elric froze. Dozens of them. Standing in a wide circle around him. They did not move closer. They only watched. Their shapes flickered as if their bodies were made of smoke, yet their eyes glowed faintly, like small coals waiting for breath to ignite them. The cavern vibrated again, and Elric felt the ground beneath him pulse once more. Then a deeper shadow emerged from between the pillars. It was larger than the others, its form almost humanoid yet impossibly distorted, as if it had been stretched too far and then forced back into a shape it was never meant to fit. Its presence made the air colder, heavier, as though each breath Elric took broke some ancient rule. The voice returned. Soft. Deep. Layered. "We have been waiting." Elric's knees weakened. He shook his head, trembling violently. "Let me go. Let me go, please." The shadow moved closer. Its steps made no sound, yet each movement rippled through the cavern like a shockwave. When it stopped only a few feet from him, Elric felt heat rise from the ground, surrounding him like invisible chains. The voice spoke again, but this time it echoed inside his skull instead of around him. "You carry our mark. You opened the door. You came when it called. Now you will remember for us." Elric felt something cold touch his forehead. His vision blurred, then vanished entirely. He was no longer in the cavern. He stood in the Amityville house again, but everything was different. The walls pulsed as if veins ran beneath the wood. A low heartbeat thudded steadily, shaking the floorboards. The room stretched, warped, their angles bending like melting wax. Elric felt his breath tighten as whispers skittered through the halls. Then he saw them. People. But not alive. Their bodies flickered in and out like memories forced into physical shapes. A man with hollow eyes crawled along the floor, whispering names that sounded like prayers. A woman stood in a corner, her mouth open in a silent scream. Two children clung to each other, crying without tears, their forms shaking with fear. The shadowy figure stood behind them all. Watching. Feeding. Elric stumbled backward, shouting. "What is this? What are you showing me?" The whisper answered immediately. "What the house remembers." Elric saw flashes of time, each moment hitting him like a sudden blow. A family entering the house in 1912, smiling nervously as they unpacked. Night after night of scraping sounds behind the walls. A child crying, pointing at the ceiling, saying that something whispered to him through the floor. The father standing in the hallway, shaking uncontrollably, muttering that the walls were breathing. Then silence. The entire family vanished. Not a trace left. Another flash. A caretaker in 1934, burning candles in every room to keep the voices quiet. He did not last a month. Another flash. Whispers calling to a couple in 1961. The man entered the basement alone. He never came back up. Elric squeezed his eyes shut, shouting for it to stop. "Please, stop, I don't want to see anymore." The cavern returned around him instantly. But the shadows were closer now. So close their shapes flickered inches from him. "You are our witness now," the voice said. "You will carry what others feared to remember." A surge of force slammed into Elric's chest, knocking him to his knees. His breath left him in a single panicked gasp. He pressed his hands against the ground as the soil beneath him began to crack open, glowing with a deeper, more violent red. The shadows leaned in. And the voice whispered again. "The house is not a place. The house is a wound. A tear in the world. We are what leaks through." Elric felt something sharp and burning press against the back of his neck. He screamed as it carved into his skin, not cutting flesh, but cutting into something deeper. His vision flashed white, then red, then nothing at all. Somewhere in the distance, he heard Marin calling his name. Her voice sounded muffled, distant, as though she were shouting underwater. Then he heard Audryn shouting words he could not understand. Light cracked through the darkness above. A thin beam. Then two. Then dozens. The shadows recoiled with a low hiss, shifting away from the light like smoke blown by wind. The cavern trembled violently. The red glow flickered. The voice growled, deep and furious. "They cannot take you. You are ours." Elric felt the ground crumble beneath him, as if the earth itself were trying to drag him deeper. But then a hand grabbed his arm. A strong, desperate pull. Marin's voice cut through the chaos. "Elric, hold on. Do not let go." He felt himself rising. The darkness clawed at him, pulling at his legs, dragging him downward with invisible hands. Screams echoed from the shadows. The cavern walls shook. The light intensified. Then he burst upward through the floor of Audryn's house, crashing onto the wooden boards with a gasp that tore through his lungs. Marin held him tightly, her arms wrapped around him, her face streaked with tears. Audryn stood beside them, breathing heavily, sweat dripping down his brow. The lanterns around the room burned with blinding white flames that flickered violently. The floor beneath them snapped shut as if nothing had ever opened. Elric lay trembling on the ground, his vision blurry. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper escaped his throat. "Did it let me go?" Audryn knelt beside him, his expression grim. "No. We pulled you out. But the mark remains." Elric felt a cold sting on the back of his neck. He reached up with shaking fingers and touched the spot. It burned. Cold and hot at the same time. A symbol carved not into skin, but into something beneath it. Maren whispered, terrified, "What did it do to you?" Elric looked into her eyes, tears forming in his own. "It showed me everything. Everything it has taken. Everything it wants. And it is not finished." The lamps flickered. The walls creaked. And from beneath the floor, the faintest whisper rose like smoke slipping through tiny cracks. "Elric. We remember. We are waiting." He shuddered, pressing his hands to his ears, but the whisper crawled beneath his skin. Maren held him tightly. Audrin whispered ancient words under his breath. The night outside grew unnervingly silent. And Elric realized with a cold certainty he could not escape. Amityville had found him again. And it would never stop looking. The air around the cabin seemed to thicken as the silence stretched on. The three of them stood completely still, as if moving even an inch might draw the attention of something waiting just beyond the walls. Outside, the forest seemed drained of all life. No crickets. No wind. Not even the rustle of branches. It felt as though the world itself were holding its breath. Then a faint tapping began. Not on the door. Not on the windows. From under the floorboards. Julia felt the sound reverberate through the soles of her shoes, a thin vibration that spread upward like a slow pulse. Mark lowered himself to one knee, pressing his ear against the wooden floor. His face twisted with confusion, then tightened into fear. "It's chanting," he whispered. The word sank into the room like a drop of ink spreading through water. Rhea backed toward the wall, shaking her head as though she could dislodge the reality forming around them. Julia strained to listen, but she heard only a muffled series of syllables, indistinct and wet, as if spoken from a mouth that wasn't shaped correctly for human language. Julia crouched beside Mark. The chanting grew louder, clearer, rhythmic in a way that made her stomach twist. It didn't sound angry. It sounded eager. Then the floor bulged. A warped swelling pushed upward between the boards, bending the planks as something beneath them pressed harder and harder, like a hand testing the strength of a barrier. The nails groaned. Dust sifted down from the seams. "Back away," Mark said, his voice low, steady, but trembling with the effort to stay calm. They retreated to the far wall. The bulge flattened suddenly. Silence. In the seconds that followed, the stillness felt worse than the movement. Julia's pulse hammered against her ribs. She had a wild thought that the cabin was listening to her heartbeat. Then 3 slow knocks came from beneath the floor. And another knock from behind them. Rhea spun around first. Her breath left her in a broken gasp. Standing in the doorway that led to the small hallway was a figure. Not a shadow. Not a hallucination. A person, or something trying to be one. Its proportions were slightly off, as if someone had sculpted a human form from memory but didn't understand how joints were supposed to work. Its head tilted far too much to one side, the neck bending at an angle no bones should allow. Its eyes were open wide, not blinking, reflecting the dim lamplight of the cabin with a glassy sheen. It smiled. But its smile kept going. Farther than lips should stretch. A second mouth forming inside the first. "We shouldn't have come," Rhea whispered. The figure stepped forward. Its feet didn't make noise. They didn't touch the ground. It seemed to hover, yet move with weight, as though it were anchored to something far below the cabin. Mark grabbed the nearest object he could find, a short iron poker from beside the fireplace. "Don't come any closer." The entity didn't stop. Its mouth opened wider. The chanting resumed beneath the floorboards, louder now, synchronized with the creature's movements. Julia felt her body tighten with a fear so raw it numbed her limbs. The house began to shake. Dust rained from the ceiling. Wooden beams creaked. It was awakening. Suddenly the creature jolted toward them, its movement a sickening snap forward as though pulled by invisible strings. Mark swung the poker hard, but it passed through the creature's torso as though cutting through fog. Yet the fog reacted. It rippled, its shape distorting before reforming, the smile never changing. Julia grabbed Rhea's wrist. "Get outside." They bolted toward the front door. Something pounded violently beneath the floor, each strike more powerful than the last, as though something massive was forcing its way upward. Julia glanced back as she reached the door. The creature in the hallway twisted its head in a full rotation, snapping vertebrae it didn't have, then pointed at them with a hand that extended far too many joints. The door swung open, but the forest outside had changed. The trees were closer than before, bending inward as if they had moved while no one was looking. The path they had taken was gone. Only darkness stretched beyond the porch, broken by tiny specks of movement among the branches. Eyes. Dozens of them. Mark stumbled onto the porch, but as Rhea followed, the wooden boards beneath her snapped open. Something reached up from the darkness below the cabin, pale and wet, gripping her ankle with impossible strength. Rhea screamed and dropped to the floor, clawing at the boards. Mark lunged forward, grabbing both her arms. Julia knelt beside them, gripping Rhea's wrist, pulling as hard as she could. Whatever held her was pulling in the opposite direction. Julia felt the force, heavy, relentless, like a tide dragging a body into deep water. Rhea's nails clawed deep grooves into the wood. Her voice cracked with panic. "It's pulling me down. It's pulling me under." The chanting beneath the cabin grew fevered, ecstatic. Then the creature from the hallway appeared beside them on the porch, as if it had simply stepped out of the shadows, its head still rotating slowly. It leaned down toward Rhea, its elongated smile stretching wider, revealing rows of teeth layered like scales. Mark screamed at it, swinging the poker wildly. This time the metal connected, but the reaction was worse. The creature's torso split open like soft clay, releasing a burst of whispering air that extinguished the nearby lantern. The porch plunged into near darkness. With a violent jerk, Rhea slipped from their hands. She sank into the gap between the boards, her scream trailing into a muffled echo, cutting off abruptly as the floor sealed shut behind her. No trace remained. Not even blood. Julia froze. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Mark stood motionless, his hand still outstretched toward the place Rhea had been. The creature's eyes gleamed in the darkness, watching them with a hunger that didn't belong to anything living. "We have to go," Julia whispered. But the forest shifted again. The trees pressed closer, branches twisting like arms reaching out to pull them back inside. The darkness thickened until it felt tangible. The world around them pulsed with the same rhythm as the chanting. Then the house exhaled. A deep, resonant breath that shook the porch boards and rattled the windows. The creature stepped backward through the front wall of the cabin, dissolving into it like smoke absorbed by dry wood. The chanting continued, but now the voices were not alone. Rhea's scream echoed faintly among them, looping, distorted, calling from far below the earth. Mark grabbed Julia's arm. "We can't stay here." They ran. The forest closed behind them, but they didn't look back. Branches whipped at their faces, roots clawed at their ankles, the ground heaving like something alive. The chanting followed them, threading through the trees, taunting them. Julia felt as if the forest were guiding them, steering them deeper, not allowing escape. At some point the chanting began coming from ahead of them too. And above. And from the earth beneath their feet. When Mark tripped, Julia tried to catch him, but the ground swallowed his legs before she could reach him. Mud and roots snaked upward, wrapping around him, pulling. His fingers scraped at the dirt, trying to claw his way free. Julia held onto his wrists with both hands. Mark's eyes were wide, filled with terror but also something else, something accepting. "It's too strong," he gasped. "Run. Julia, run." She shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "No. I'm not leaving you." The forest exhaled again. And Mark vanished into the earth, swallowed whole. The ground smoothed out, leaving nothing behind. Julia staggered backward. The chanting crescendoed, surrounding her entirely. The air vibrated with it, pressing against her skull, seeping into her thoughts. She turned and ran, not knowing where she was going, only that she had to move. But the forest shifted with her. Every direction led deeper in, twisting endlessly back toward the cabin. She stopped only when she felt a presence behind her. Slowly she turned. The cabin stood in front of her. Only now it wasn't a structure. It was breathing. The walls rose and fell with long, slow inhalations. The windows widened like eyes adjusting to focus on her. The door cracked open, but instead of darkness, she saw a vast cavernous throat pulsing with wet movement. Rhea's voice called her name from inside. Mark's voice followed. Then others. So many others. Voices spanning years, decades, maybe centuries. All begging. All pleading. All luring. Julia took a step back. The cabin took a step forward. The forest bowed its branches toward her, guiding her, offering her to the thing she had awakened. Julia screamed, turning to run. And the ground beneath her opened like a mouth. She fell. The chanting erupted into triumphant frenzy as the earth swallowed her whole, dragging her into the same darkness that had taken the others. Her scream was the last sound the forest heard before the world fell silent again. The cabin exhaled once more. Then everything went still, as if nothing had ever happened. And far below the earth, in a place without light, the chanting continued. Patient. Hungry. Waiting for the next visitor who would open the wrong door. The forest never gave Julia back. For 3 days, search teams combed the woods. Dogs refused to go near the clearing. Drones lost signal every time they passed over where the cabin should have been. When officers pushed deeper into the trees, they found only an empty patch of dirt and dead leaves, not a single footprint, not a single sign of a building ever having stood there. But they all heard it. Every person who stepped foot near that place reported the same thing, a faint knocking beneath the ground, like something calling to be let out. Some said they heard voices too. Muffled. Crying. Whispering. Begging. One ranger quit after hearing her own name being whispered from the soil. By the end of the week, the forest was put under restricted access, labeled as unstable terrain. But late at night, travelers still swear they see a flicker of warm light between the trees, like a lantern glowing behind old cabin windows. And if anyone walks too close, the light goes out all at once, followed by 3 slow knocks beneath their feet. Locals say the forest moves, searching for new visitors. It builds itself a doorway wherever it needs one. And if you happen to find it, if you step onto that porch and hear breathing behind the walls, there is only one thing you must never do. Never open the door. Because the moment you do, the forest goes quiet. The house wakes up. And it remembers you.